Coronavirus has, of course, upended life completely across the country, so not that surprising. There are now reports of quarantines in immigration and customs enforcement detention. According to a piece from the nation's D.C. correspondent Ken Klippenstein, 9 detainees have been isolated and is currently monitoring 24 other people.
ICE says none of these are specific coronavirus cases. They're documented in a leaked document about the organization's pandemic response. The report also mentions preparations to convert major border facilities into quarantine buildings. So, the nation's D.C. correspondent, Ken Klippenstein, joins us now. Ken, it's great to see you. Great friend of the show. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing all right, all things considered. How about you guys?
Yeah, we're social distancing and we're staying alive. All right, so Ken, you've got this new piece in The Nation. Tell us a little bit about it. What did you learn?
Yeah, so what's happening is there's ICE detainees that are being quarantined across 10 different facilities, and this is what people in the sort of rights community have been warning would happen. Not just that coronavirus would affect the detainees given the conditions within the cells, conditions pointed out not just by activists but by DHS's own Inspector General report, which found that there are unsanitary and dangerous conditions, close quarters. All of this is very conducive to an outbreak of an illness like this. And the real threat here is not just to the people in detention, but to that spreading to the general public as well.
And Ken, how much do we know about, have any detainees tested positive for coronavirus? Do we know that? What sort of measures have been taken to prevent this kind of spread, and have employees been affected?
The measures don't sound great. There was an ICE detainee strike 2 days ago for soap. So that should give you an idea of the resources that they don't have. And as for what we know about which detainees being quarantined may have coronavirus, we know that at least one does. And that actually came out about an hour or two after my story was published. I can't know for sure if those two things are related, but what I do know is that the document that was leaked to me from someone within DHS showed again that there were these instances of quarantine across 10 different facilities, and the document was titled something like "Coronavirus Placemat." It was a sort of situation report regarding coronavirus. The entire report was about coronavirus, so I would be surprised if at least some of those cases did not have symptoms consistent with that.
Interesting. Ken, while we have you, of course, you've been observing, what's going on here in Washington and much of this. One thing I actually wanted to hear your thoughts on is I saw this David Day, and this has been bubbling around, is that we didn't see Elizabeth Warren really stand up as a fighter in this crisis. She set out 8 different types of criteria for things that would need to meet her package for a vote. None of the 8 were actually met, and she voted for it anyway. What are your thoughts on that generally, as to see somebody who went from being a bailout warrior and kind of rose to prominence on that, and then didn't really step up to the occasion whenever the time came?
Well, I think the whole narrative that Sanders and Warren were going to sort of tag team, the Washington centrist brigade turned out to not be so true. I was heartened at first when she, released her criteria, which I think a lot of which made sense. Perhaps didn't go far enough, but a lot of the criteria made sense. But then for her not to follow up on that and appear to capitulate to what essentially the Republicans ended up putting together in this sort of, frankly, Frankenstein bailout was, disappointing to say the least. And again, I think people that said that, these two candidates are more or less the same have egg in their face now.
Yeah. And I mean, look, Bernie Sanders stood up against Lindsey Graham and those folks who wanted to cut the unemployment benefits down, in my view, unconscionably. And he kind of stopped that in his tracks and really held them to account last night. But ultimately, they all voted for it.
Voted for it, too.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, we're seeing a situation where it's really stark who runs the country, whose needs are being attended to, who's being offered, what was it, $1,200 in a one-time payment, ordinary people, versus who is getting cut to the front of the line and getting the best treatment, Boeing, these huge multinational corporations that, let me remind you, have spent the last several decades gutting the federal government and its ability to respond to a crisis like this. They are the ones being showered in the most ostentatious and generous bailout conditions.
And Ken, I mean, generally, what does this tell us about? I mean, and this is the other thing for you as an investigative reporter, how difficult it is to actually get to the bottom of how the money is dispersed and so much of the oversight. Could you just speak to that? I don't think people really understand how difficult it is to achieve actual transparency when this amount of money is moving through the U.S. federal government, as somebody who tries to track things like this yourself.
Oh, it's extraordinarily difficult. And I think in a case like coronavirus, you're seeing how dangerous the sort of Faustian bargain that we have made over the last several decades in terms of all of these public-private partnerships, so-called, in responding not just to this crisis, but to other ones, the kind of problems that creates. So when you have these public-private partnerships, we were just talking about ICE a moment ago, it's really hard to figure out what's going on because they can say, oh, this is a private company. You can't issue a FOIA request. There's almost no presumption of transparency for these private bodies. You can't see, it's really hard to see their ledgers. If it's a big corporation, the most you'll get is, quarterly reports, something like that. So these corporations operate in pretty close to total secrecy. I often joke with my friends, it's easier for me to find out what's going on in the Pentagon than what's going on Wall Street.
Mm.
Yeah, it's so well said. And there's also the irony of Democrats who obviously impeached the president in the House, who feel very strongly that he's the worst president that we've ever had, a unique threat to national security, then going along with a $500 billion, capitalized up to $4 trillion corporate bailout that's basically at his administration's complete discretion.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous. There's no checks on this guy. I mean, we have a video of Bernie Sanders screaming at the top of his lungs, which I think is consistent with the mood of the country. If the country is ordinary people and maybe not folks living in Raytheon Acres, Virginia. But as for the rest of, the Senate and Congress generally, that's not a tone that I'm seeing reflected. And that's to their detriment, because I do think that's the attitude generally.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Well, Ken, it's great to talk to you. It's great seeing you again. Stay safe, and we'll have you back on the show. It's good to see you, my friend.
Be well, Ken. We'll see you soon.
Good to talk to you guys.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.